The Martinez family lived on Drive in a neighborhood so picture-perfect it could have been plucked straight from a suburban magazine spread. Tree-lined streets, white picket fences, children playing until the street lights flickered on. The kind of place where parents felt safe enough to let their kids ride bikes unsupervised, and where everyone knew everyone else's business. Emma Martinez was the light of her parents' lives. She was 8 years old with copper-colored braids, a gap-toothed smile, and a laugh that seemed to contain genuine joy. She loved books, soccer, and her teacher said she was the most conscientious student in her third-grade class. On Tuesday, March 14th, the weather was unusually warm for Ohio, one of those false spring days that tricks you into thinking winter has finally released its grip. Emma had asked her mother if she could ride her bicycle to the corner store to buy a. It was a routine she'd done 100 times before. The store was only 3 blocks away. The neighborhood was safe. Nothing bad happened on Drive. Nothing bad happened to people like them. Her mother, Sophia Martinez, had hesitated for only a moment before saying yes. That moment of hesitation would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Stay on the main streets," Sophia called out as Emma pedaled away. "Don't talk to strangers. Be home by 5 o'clock for dinner." Standard mother warnings, delivered with the casual assumption that the world was a predictable and relatively safe place. Emma waved without looking back, her 9-year-old legs pumping the pedals of her pink bicycle decorated with plastic streamers. The corner store manager remembered Emma that afternoon. She bought her blue raspberry, her favorite, and talked briefly about her upcoming soccer tournament. She seemed happy, excited about the weekend. The store manager would repeat this to police officers later, his voice cracking with guilt as if he should have somehow sensed the danger closing in around this child. At 4:47 p.m., Emma was spotted by Mrs., a neighbor 2 houses down from the Martinezes, riding her bike back home. She was eating her and humming something. Mrs. would later tell police it sounded like a Disney song. The time mattered. The police would mark it in their reports with desperate precision, trying to pinpoint exactly when Emma's ordinary afternoon became something unimaginable. 17 minutes, that's all it took. By 5:04 p.m., Sophia began to grow concerned. Emma was typically punctual, almost obsessively so. By 5:15 p.m., concern had transformed into worry. Sophia called the corner store, and the manager confirmed Emma had been there. By 5:30 p.m., worry had metamorphosed into something darker, a mother's primitive instinct screaming that something was profoundly wrong. Sophia ran up and down Drive calling Emma's name. The streamers on Emma's bike were found 20 minutes later, tangled in a bush 3 blocks from home, near an old Victorian house that had been undergoing renovations for months. The house belonged to David and their teenage son, Richardson, had been home alone that day. Sophia's scream when she found those streamers would echo through the neighborhood like a gunshot, shattering the illusion of safety that had blanketed Drive for so long. Within minutes, every parent within earshot was looking for Emma. By 6:00 p.m., Sophia had called 911. By 6:30 p.m., police units were swarming the neighborhood. By 7:00 p.m., the first news vans arrived, their satellite dishes rising like vultures circling wounded prey. The police methodically searched the Victorian house first. Richardson was there, cooperative and friendly, answering all their questions with disarming ease. No, he hadn't seen Emma. No, he didn't know anything about a bicycle or streamers. Yes, he'd been home all afternoon but had been in his room watching television. The police found nothing immediately suspicious. They searched his room, found nothing incriminating. Richardson had an uncanny ability to seem innocent, a skill that had kept him undetected for years, despite his disturbing obsessions, documented in his private journals that police would only discover later. The search expanded. Volunteers formed teams. Dogs were brought in. The Ohio State Police coordinated with local authorities. Every parent in the neighborhood watched their own children with new, terrified awareness. News helicopters circled overhead. The missing person details were broadcast on every local station by 9:00 p.m. 8-year-old Emma Martinez, brown eyes, copper-colored hair, pink bicycle, last seen wearing a purple jacket. By midnight, the search had become frantic and desperate. Emma's father, Roberto, stood in their living room with his wife and police officers, both parents looking like they were being slowly buried alive under the weight of every parent's worst nightmare. Search teams checked abandoned buildings, wooded areas, storm drains, and every possible location where a child could be hidden. Police helicopters swept the area with floodlights. Then, at 2:17 a.m., a security guard doing rounds at the abandoned Riverside Industrial Park, 6 blocks away, noticed a small figure walking alone on the perimeter road. The figure was a child in a purple jacket, moving in a daze, barefoot and trembling despite the relatively warm night. The guard approached carefully, speaking in soft tones, and recognized the missing girl from the news reports. Emma was alive, but something fundamental had shattered inside her. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Emma was wrapped in blankets, physically unharmed except for minor bruises and scratches on her legs and arms. But her eyes were different, hollow and distant, as if some essential part of her consciousness had been locked away in a place the paramedics couldn't reach. She didn't speak, not when the EMTs asked her questions, not when her parents rushed to her side, weeping with relief and confusion, not when police gently asked her what had happened. Emma's lips remained sealed. Her voice had vanished as mysteriously as she had disappeared from her bicycle ride, leaving behind only questions, trauma, and a family shattered by the realization that the safe neighborhood they'd believed in was an illusion, that danger didn't knock on doors in uniform. It lived in the house next door, wearing a human face, waiting for moments of ordinary trust to crack open like eggshells. The police arrested Richardson at 7:30 a.m. that morning. But without Emma's testimony, without her voice describing what happened in that basement, the real battle was only beginning. The pediatrician's office smelled like sanitizer and childhood, fluorescent lights overhead, motivational posters of cartoon characters on the walls, a waiting room filled with toys designed to distract from fear. Emma sat on her mother's lap, her small body rigid and unresponsive. Doctor had been the Martinez family's pediatrician for 6 years. She knew Emma as a vibrant, talkative child who always asked intelligent questions and made jokes during checkups. The child sitting before her now looked like Emma's ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm going to look in your ears, okay?" Doctor spoke in her gentle professional voice, the one perfected over 30 years of working with frightened children. Emma didn't respond. She didn't nod. She didn't protest. She simply allowed herself to be examined like a doll without agency or will. The physical examination revealed no serious injuries, though there were bruises on her inner thighs and small lacerations consistent with trauma. Nothing that wouldn't heal physically. Everything that would never heal emotionally. Doctor's eyes met Sophia's, and in that glance passed an understanding that needed no words. This child was wounded in ways that stethoscopes couldn't measure. She prescribed therapy and recommended a trauma specialist, her voice heavy with the weight of truth, that the worst injuries are often invisible. The first therapist was Dr. Michael, a child psychologist with 15 years of experience treating traumatized children. His office was deliberately designed to feel safe, soft lighting, comfortable furniture, shelves filled with toys and art supplies. He specialized in play therapy, understanding that young children often express what they cannot verbalize through drawing, building, and imagination. Emma participated in the sessions with mechanical compliance. She sat in the office. She held crayons. But she didn't draw anything recognizable, just chaotic scribbles, dark colors layered over and over until the paper nearly tore. After 3 weeks, Doctor requested a meeting with Sophia and Roberto in his private office. He sat across from them with a folder containing notes and observations, his expression serious and concerned. "Emma is exhibiting classic symptoms of severe trauma," he explained, adjusting his glasses. Selective mutism, where she's choosing not to speak as a psychological response to overwhelming stress. The silence is her mind's way of protecting itself. It's not that she can't speak. She won't speak, and forcing her to talk about what happened could actually deepen her trauma response. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face before she even fully absorbed his words. How long will this last? When will she talk again? That's difficult to predict, doctor said carefully. Some children recover their speech relatively quickly, weeks to months. Others take years. The timeline depends entirely on Emma's psychological processing and her feeling of safety. The school psychologist, Tors, offered similarly discouraging assessments. Emma attended third grade but didn't participate in discussions. She wouldn't raise her hand or volunteer answers. Teachers reported that she sat silently at lunch and didn't interact with classmates. During recess, she stood alone by the fence, watching other children play without attempting to join. The school prepared an individualized education plan, implementing accommodations for her selective mutism, but everyone understood that academic progress was secondary to psychological recovery. Meanwhile, the legal machinery began turning with its own ponderous inevitability. Detective James Riley, a seasoned investigator with a personal investment in protecting children, had been assigned to the case. Without Emma's testimony, his evidence was fragmentary. Circumstantial fibers found in Richardson's room that might match Emma's jacket, inconclusive timeline issues, neighbors' observations, but nothing definitive. The district attorney's office was in turmoil. Assistant DA Jennifer, a prosecutor known for her relentless pursuit of justice for vulnerable victims, took personal responsibility for the case. She was a mother of 3 herself, and the image of little Emma's hollow eyes haunted her. She spent evenings reviewing case files, researching precedents for child testimony, and exploring every possible avenue to build a prosecutable case. "Without the victim's testimony, we have almost nothing," said Richard, the defense attorney assigned to Richardson, during a preliminary hearing 3 weeks after Emma's discovery. Was the kind of lawyer who made prosecutors' lives difficult through technical expertise and aggressive advocacy. "My client has a constitutional right to confront his accuser. Without this child's testimony, the entire case collapses." Jennifer fought back with every tool available to her. She filed motions to allow video testimony, to protect Emma from the trauma of live courtroom appearance, to establish hearsay exceptions. But every motion faced the fundamental problem. Richardson had a constitutional right to cross-examine his accuser, and that right was nearly absolute. 3 months after Emma's abduction, the case was in danger of complete collapse. The grand jury had indicted Richardson based on circumstantial evidence and probable cause, but conviction required proof beyond reasonable doubt. That proof resided entirely in Emma's shattered psyche, locked behind walls of selective mutism that no therapist or legal procedure could penetrate. Roberto and Sophia were living in a nightmare of uncertainty. Their daughter was home physically but unreachable emotionally. She had violent nightmares, waking at 3 a.m. screaming wordlessly. She refused to be alone in any room. She wouldn't bathe or shower without her mother present. She had developed severe anxiety about leaving the house, panic attacks triggered by unexpected noises. Sophia had taken leave from her job to care for Emma full-time. Roberto walked around their home like a broken man, rage and helplessness warring within him. "Why won't she talk?" Sophia asked Doctor during one session, her voice breaking with desperation. "Doesn't she understand that we need to know what happened, that this man needs to be stopped?" "Emma understands on some level," Doctor replied gently. "But her survival mechanism is telling her that speaking about it means reliving it, and her mind is protecting her from that pain. The silence feels safer than the words." At night, Jennifer sat in her office with case files spread across her desk, reading and rereading Emma's medical reports, police statements, and the fragmentary evidence. She thought about her own 8-year-old daughter, playing soccer just like Emma, innocent and vulnerable. The thought that a predator might walk free because the legal system couldn't find a way to hear from his victim was unbearable. She began researching unconventional approaches. She called colleagues in other states. She consulted with trauma experts. She attended workshops on innovative victim support strategies. And then, during a late-night search through legal databases and law enforcement resources, she discovered something: a specialized program in Ohio that trained police dogs as courtroom support animals for traumatized witnesses. She read about Officer and his German Shepherd. She reviewed their credentials, their training certifications, the research supporting their effectiveness. And for the first time in 3 months, Jennifer felt something ignite in her chest, not quite hope, but its possibility flickering like a candle in the darkness. The wall of Emma's silence still stood, impenetrable and absolute. But Jennifer was beginning to glimpse a way through it, a path that no one had considered before. A path that would require not a detective or a therapist or a prosecutor, but a dog. Officer had always been different from the typical K-9 handler. While his colleagues treated their police dogs primarily as tools, extensions of law enforcement designed to detect drugs, apprehend suspects, or track fugitives, saw something deeper in his dogs. He understood them as sentient beings capable of nuance, emotional intelligence, and complex social bonding. When he was assigned, a 3-year-old German Shepherd with impeccable credentials and an impressive arrest record immediately recognized something special in the dog's eyes. Wasn't just a working animal. He possessed an unusual empathy that transcended his training. Had been on the police force for 17 years. He'd seen the worst of human behavior, the violence and cruelty that lurked beneath suburban facades. He'd also witnessed the profound impact that trauma had on victims, particularly children. 5 years earlier, he'd worked a case involving a 10-year-old witness to a violent crime. The child had been so terrified during the trial that his testimony had been nearly incoherent. The defendant had been acquitted on a technicality. Had never forgotten the look on that child's face, not just fear, but the realization that the legal system had failed him. That experience had planted a seed. Began researching trauma-informed approaches to law enforcement. He attended seminars on victim support. He read psychological literature on anxiety reduction, and he discovered something remarkable: evidence-based research showing that the presence of animals significantly reduced anxiety in traumatized individuals without compromising the accuracy of their testimony. The research was compelling, the implications revolutionary. 7 years into his K-9 career with as his partner, made a bold decision. He petitioned the Ohio Police Academy and the state's Judicial Oversight Committee to pursue a specialized certification in courtroom support animal training. The proposal was met with skepticism. Several senior officers dismissed it as soft policing, a waste of a perfectly good police dog's talents, but was persistent. He found funding through a victim advocacy nonprofit. He connected with Dr., a leading researcher in trauma psychology and animal-assisted intervention at Ohio State University. Together, they developed a comprehensive training protocol. The training took 18 months. Learn to remain perfectly calm in courtroom environments, with all the unfamiliar sounds, people, and emotional energy that such settings generated. More importantly, learn to recognize and respond to anxiety signals in traumatized individuals. He learned to press against a person's leg in response to elevated heart rate, to provide grounding through physical contact, to remain focused and steady as an emotional anchor. The training wasn't about tricks or commands. It was about emotional intelligence deployed strategically to create a sense of safety and stability. Documented everything meticulously. He filmed responses to various stimuli. He recorded behavioral metrics, heart rate changes in handlers before and after interventions, anxiety scale measurements, cortisol level reductions. He compiled research studies supporting the efficacy of animal-assisted therapy in forensic settings. By the time received his courtroom support certification, had built an ironclad case for the dog's legitimacy backed by scientific evidence and rigorous training protocols. The Ohio criminal justice system officially recognized as a certified courtroom support animal in 2019. He was one of only 12 such dogs in the state. Most handlers and legal professionals still didn't know about the program. It remained relatively obscure, used sparingly in select cases, and had appeared in 3 trials over 2 years, each time successfully reducing witness anxiety without any complications or legal challenges. The success rate was perfect, but the program remained largely unknown outside specialized victim advocacy circles. When Jennifer called Officer Station with her unusual request, the dispatcher initially thought it was a prank, a police dog in a courtroom. The skepticism was immediate and universal, but Jennifer was undeterred. She had researched extensively. She understood the science. She knew the precedents, and more importantly, she had nothing left to lose. The case against Richardson was falling apart. Without something radical, justice would slip away like water through desperate fingers. Agreed to meet with Jennifer at the district attorney's office on a Tuesday morning. He brought a portfolio of certifications, research papers on courtroom support animals, and documentation of his previous trial appearances. Jennifer pored over the materials with intense focus, asking detailed questions about his training, his reliability, potential legal challenges. "Can a defense attorney challenge his presence?" Jennifer asked, her lawyer's mind already anticipating obstacles. "Absolutely," nodded. "And they'll have legitimate concerns about jury prejudice. But the research shows that properly trained support animals don't bias juries against defendants. They simply reduce the witness's anxiety, which paradoxically can make testimony more coherent and credible." "What's track record?" Jennifer pressed. 3 trials, 3 guilty verdicts, replied. "No acquittals, no complications. But I'll be honest, those were different cases, different dynamics. This is a child victim, which is more complex emotionally and legally." Jennifer leaned back in her chair, processing. "What would you need from me to bring into this case?" Had already thought this through. "First, I'd need to meet with Emma and her parents. Doesn't work if the child is terrified of the dog. We need genuine comfort with his presence. Second, I'd need weeks of preparation, multiple sessions in the empty courtroom so Emma becomes accustomed to the environment beside her. Third, I'd need psychological documentation supporting the need for his presence. And fourth, you'd need to be prepared for a legal fight. The defense will challenge everything." "The defense will challenge everything anyway," Jennifer said, a slight smile crossing her face for the first time in months. "At least we have a chance." The following Saturday morning arrived at the Martinez family home with on a leash. Sophia had been skeptical when Jennifer suggested the arrangement. A police dog. It seemed absurd, gimmicky even, but she was desperate enough to consider anything. Roberto answered the door, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Emma's upstairs," Sophia said quietly. "She's been anxious all week knowing someone was coming." Brought into the living room slowly, deliberately. He didn't force anything. He simply sat on the couch and let lie on the floor, allowing the dog's presence to settle into the space naturally. 10 minutes passed in silence. Sophia and Roberto sat watching, uncertain what they were witnessing. Then Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, peering down at the large German shepherd in her living room. Her body was tense, ready to retreat, but sensing the child's presence, lifted his head and made eye contact without moving toward her. It was the smallest acknowledgement, not aggressive, not demanding, just a recognition of her existence. Emma descended the stairs slowly, one step at a time. She sat on the bottom step, maintaining distance. His tail wagged softly. 20 minutes passed. Then, as if making a significant decision, Emma moved to sit on the floor near. She didn't touch him. She just sat nearby and shifted his head to rest on his paws, completely at peace. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face. In that moment, something shifted. Had done what no therapist, no legal strategy, no adult could accomplish. He had created a space where Emma felt safe enough to simply exist in the presence of another being. It wasn't recovery, it wasn't testimony, but it was the first real crack in Emma's wall of silence. Looked at Jennifer across the room. They shared a knowing glance. This was going to work. It had to work. The empty courthouse on Saturday mornings had a peculiar quality, haunting and peaceful simultaneously. The usual chaos of judicial proceedings was absent. The gallery sat vacant. The judge's bench loomed empty and austere. Only the soft echo of footsteps disturbed the silence as officer led Emma and her parents through the corridors. Walked beside Emma, his massive frame somehow smaller and gentler in the absence of courtroom formality. This was their second week of preparation. After that first meeting at the Martinez home, Emma had begun to change in subtle but significant ways. She still didn't speak, but her rigid tension had eased slightly. She had started allowing to visit twice weekly and had become a fixture in their home, lying on the kitchen floor while Emma did homework, sleeping at the foot of her bed during the night. Sophia reported that Emma's nightmares had decreased in frequency. She was sleeping longer stretches without waking in terror. "Come on," Emma said gently as they approached the courtroom doors. "Wants to show you something today." Emma's hand remained firmly clasped in Sophia's, but her eyes betrayed curiosity. She nodded slightly, the smallest gesture of agreement. They entered the courtroom together, and Emma's body immediately tensed. This was the space where she would have to testify, where she would have to face the man who had hurt her, where she would have to speak about things she'd spent 4 months trying to forget through silence. Led them to the witness box. He helped Emma climb up into the elevated chair. It was designed for adults, and Emma's feet didn't touch the floor. She looked impossibly small and vulnerable, a child drowning in the machinery of the legal system. Positioned himself directly beneath the witness box, a massive shadow of reassurance. "This is where you'll sit when you testify," explained, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "But we'll be right here. He won't go anywhere. He'll stay as close to you as the court will allow. His job is simply to be here with you, to help you feel less alone." Emma stared at. The dog looked up at her from his position on the courtroom floor, his dark eyes steady and present. For the first time since her abduction, Emma made a sound, not words but a small sigh, almost of relief. She reached down tentatively and shifted his massive head to rest against her dangling foot. Over the following weeks, their Saturday morning sessions became a ritual, was methodical in his approach, gradually acclimating Emma to the courtroom environment without overwhelming her. The first session was just sitting in the witness box with present. The second session involved Sophia asking Emma simple questions: "What's your favorite color? Do you like pizza?" while Emma sat in the witness box. Third session. The courtroom doors opened, and Roberto listened from the gallery. Fourth session. Posed more structured questions, mimicking what a prosecutor might ask. Each session pushed boundaries incrementally. Each session required Emma to trust a little more, to feel a little safer, to tolerate a little more of the environment that had come to represent everything she feared. But something remarkable was happening. Sophia noticed changes at home that couldn't be attributed to the passage of time alone. Emma was laughing, actual laughter, during breakfast. She had started humming while drawing. Most significantly, she was beginning to communicate through writing. She'd never been completely mute. She could write notes, could type messages on the family iPad. But in early sessions she'd resisted even that limited communication. Now she was writing messages to, "Good boy, I like you. Are you coming tomorrow?" Dr. Michael, Emma's trauma therapist, was astonished by the progress. In their weekly sessions, Emma had begun drawing pictures that showed progression rather than just chaos. Early drawings had been all dark scribbles and violent marks. Now her pictures included, clearly recognizable as a dog, rendered with care and detail, surrounded by hearts and stars. "She's processing her trauma differently now," Doctor explained to Jennifer during a consultation call. "The dog isn't replacing therapy, but it's creating a psychological space where healing can happen." Emma is learning that she can be present with something large and potentially intimidating, is a big, powerful dog, and feel safe. That's recontextualizing her understanding of safety and control. Had also been working with Dr. Lisa Park, a clinical psychologist specializing in courtroom testimony by traumatized witnesses. Lisa attended several of their Saturday morning sessions, observing and documenting Emma's responses. She was particularly interested in the moments when Emma showed anxiety symptoms, increased heart rate, shallow breathing, tension in her shoulders, and how responded. "Watch this," told Lisa during one session. Emma was practicing answering questions about general topics, school, friends, hobbies, when suddenly her breathing became rapid and she tensed noticeably. Had just asked her to imagine the prosecutor asking about the day she disappeared. Immediately lifted his head and pressed it firmly against Emma's leg. Emma's breathing slowed. Her shoulders dropped. Within 30 seconds, her anxiety had diminished measurably. "It's remarkable," Lisa said, taking notes. "The dog isn't just a comfort object. He's actively interrupting the anxiety response cycle. Emma's brain is learning that anxiety doesn't have to escalate. The presence of the dog provides a circuit breaker." By week 6 of their preparation, something extraordinary happened. Emma and were alone in the courtroom during a Saturday morning session. Sophia and Roberto waited outside in the hall, giving Emma space. Was asking her questions about her schooling, safe topics, neutral territory. Then asked gently, "Emma, would you like to write about what happened that day? Not the scary part, just what you remember about the afternoon before everything changed." Emma's body stiffened. Her hands trembled, immediately pressed against her leg. Emma closed her eyes, breathing deeply. When she opened them, she picked up the pen and paper had provided. Her handwriting was shaky, childish, but the words came. "I rode my bike, got blue strawberry. Mrs. said hi, I was happy." It was the first time Emma had voluntarily written about that day in any detail. Felt tears burning his eyes. It was just a few sentences, just the mundane details of an ordinary afternoon. But it was also a monumental breakthrough. Emma had chosen to engage with the memory, to describe it, to take ownership of her own narrative. Over the following weeks, Emma gradually wrote more. Not about the basement, not about what Richardson had done, but about the before, the bike ride, the friendly wave from Mrs., the normalcy that had been shattered. She was building a relationship with her own story, reclaiming pieces of it incrementally. More importantly, she began to whisper, not full words at first, but fragments. She'd lean toward during their sessions and whisper a single word, "Dog, tomorrow." The whispers were so quiet that only someone listening intently could hear them, but they represented a monumental transformation. Emma's voice was returning. By week 8, Sophia reported something miraculous. Emma had asked her a question out loud. Just 3 words, whispered so quietly that Sophia had to ask her to repeat it, but audible nonetheless. "Can stay." Sophia had wept when she told Jennifer about that moment during their phone consultation. "She spoke," Sophia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Our daughter spoke. I didn't think. I wasn't sure she would ever speak again." And had accomplished what no therapy, no medication, no legal strategy could achieve alone. They had created a space of safety so profound that Emma's traumatized mind had begun to believe that healing was possible. The wall of silence was cracking. Light was beginning to seep through. And in just 4 weeks, Emma would have to walk into that courtroom for real, facing her attacker, and testify to what happened in that basement. The pressure was immense, but for the first time since her abduction, Emma had something worth speaking for. The presence of a dog who had shown her that trust could exist even in the most terrifying circumstances. The motion hearing took place on a cold November morning in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. Judge sat at her elevated bench, her reading glasses perched on her nose, reviewing the thick stack of documents that had been filed by both the prosecution and defense. She had been a judge for 22 years, had presided over hundreds of cases, and prided herself on her fairness and adherence to constitutional principles. But this case presented something unprecedented in her courtroom experience. Richard, the defense attorney, was already known to judge as a formidable legal opponent. He had successfully defended dozens of cases through meticulous legal maneuvering, constitutional challenges, and his ability to exploit procedural technicalities. His client, Richardson, sat beside him at the defense table wearing a dark suit and an expression of practiced innocence. The prosecution's case was problematic and knew it intimately. Without the child's testimony, everything else was circumstantial. When Jennifer filed her motion to allow presence during Emma's testimony, immediately filed a countermotion to exclude the dog entirely. His arguments were compelling and grounded in solid legal precedent. He submitted briefs citing constitutional protections, jury prejudice standards, and case law about the admissibility of emotional support measures in criminal proceedings. "Your Honor," began, rising from his seat with the confidence of a lawyer who had successfully argued before appellate courts, "the prosecution is attempting to circumvent fundamental principles of criminal justice through an emotional sleight of hand. They want to parade a dog into this courtroom not for any legitimate evidentiary purpose, but to generate sympathy for the witness and prejudice the jury against my client." He walked toward the judge, his movements deliberate and precise. "The defendant's Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses is sacred to our legal system. This dog serves no purpose except to inflame the jury's emotions. It's prosecutorial misconduct dressed up in the language of victim advocacy." Presented case law supporting his position. Decisions from other jurisdictions where appellate courts had expressed concern about courtroom demonstrations designed to manipulate jury emotions. He argued that allowing the dog would violate Richardson's constitutional rights and set a dangerous precedent for future cases. Jennifer rose to present the prosecution's counterargument. She was prepared for this fight. She had spent weeks researching, consulting with experts, and building an ironclad scientific foundation for presence. "Your Honor, the defense characterizes this as emotional manipulation, but that misrepresents what courtroom support animals actually accomplish," Jennifer said, her voice steady and professional. "This is not about inflaming emotions. This is about creating conditions where a traumatized child can testify truthfully and accurately." She presented research papers from peer-reviewed journals. She submitted testimony from Dr. Lisa Park about the psychological mechanisms of trauma and anxiety. She provided documentation of rigorous training, his certifications, and his track record in other trials. She cited emerging case law from progressive jurisdictions recognizing the validity of properly trained support animals. "The defense would have this court believe that allowing a support dog somehow violates the defendant's rights," Jennifer continued. "But constitutional jurisprudence has consistently recognized that reasonable accommodations for vulnerable witnesses don't violate defendants' rights. We allow closed-circuit testimony for child witnesses. We allow victims to have support persons present during questioning. We permit expert testimony to help juries understand trauma responses. All of these measures protect vulnerable witnesses without compromising the defendant's ability to confront evidence." She gestured toward a stack of documents. "The research is clear. Properly trained support animals reduce anxiety without affecting the accuracy or reliability of testimony. In fact, testimony from less anxious witnesses is typically more coherent and credible." The defendant's argument that this somehow prejudices him ignores the fundamental reality that his rights are protected by the ability to cross-examine the witness, to challenge her testimony, to present evidence of unreliability. The presence of doesn't change any of that. Officer was called to testify about training and credentials. Cross-examined him aggressively, trying to establish that was fundamentally a police dog designed for intimidation, and that his presence in a courtroom would inherently bias a jury. "Officer, isn't it true that is a German Shepherd trained in suspect apprehension?" asked, packing in front of the witness box. "Is trained in multiple law enforcement functions," replied calmly, having anticipated this line of questioning. "But his courtroom support certification is entirely separate from his police work. He's been specifically trained to remain calm and non-threatening in judicial settings." But juries see a police dog, don't they? They associate police dogs with police authority, with the government's power, with the idea that suspects are dangerous, pressed. "That's a possible concern, which is why the prosecution has proposed specific jury instructions explaining its actual role," responded. "The jury will be told that its presence is solely for the witness's emotional support and has no evidentiary significance whatsoever." The hearing lasted 3 days. Both sides presented expert witnesses. Dr. Lisa Park about the neurobiology of trauma and how support animals interrupt anxiety cycles without affecting cognitive accuracy. A defense expert, called Bai, argued that any animal in a courtroom was inherently prejudicial to a defendant. Judge took the bench on the 4th day to deliver her ruling. She had clearly spent considerable time deliberating, weighing the competing interests, wrestling with the constitutional balance between protecting vulnerable witnesses and ensuring defendants' rights. "This is unprecedented in my courtroom," Judge began, her voice grave and thoughtful. "And this matter implicates fundamental constitutional principles that I don't take lightly. However, after careful review of the evidence, the research, and applicable case law, I find that the presence of a properly trained courtroom support animal does not violate the defendant's constitutional rights when appropriate safeguards are implemented." She outlined her ruling methodically. Would be permitted to sit on the floor beside the witness box during Emma's testimony. The jury would receive specific instructions that its presence was solely for the witness's emotional support and had no evidentiary significance. The jury would be instructed not to consider the dog's presence in evaluating the credibility or reliability of the witness's testimony. Cross-examination rights remained unaffected. The defendant retained all constitutional protections. Furthermore, Judge continued, the court finds that the research supporting the efficacy of properly trained support animals in reducing anxiety in traumatized witnesses is sufficiently established. This accommodation serves the legitimate judicial purpose of enabling a vulnerable child witness to testify more effectively, which serves the interests of justice, without compromising the defendant's constitutional rights. His face darkened as he listened. He had believed he would win this motion. He had been certain that constitutional principles would prevail. He had underestimated the judge's willingness to recognize evolving best practices in victim advocacy, and he had miscalculated the strength of Jennifer's scientific foundation. "However," Judge continued, and everyone in the courtroom tensed, waiting for the inevitable limitation, "I'm imposing specific parameters. Officer, the dog will be positioned between the witness and the defendant so that the witness is not looking directly at her attacker. The dog will remain on the floor throughout the testimony. Any signs of behavioral problems, any indication that the dog is disruptive or affecting the proceedings, and I will order the dog removed immediately. The parties will have an opportunity to address any concerns before trial. Trial will begin 4 weeks from today." She banged her gavel and the motion hearing concluded, immediately whispered something to his client, Richardson's expression unreadable. Jennifer felt waves of relief and triumph washing through her, though she maintained her professional composure. She glanced toward where Officer sat in the gallery, gave her a subtle nod. They had cleared the first major hurdle. But everyone in that courtroom understood that the real battle was still ahead. The trial would determine everything, and everything depended on a small girl finding the courage to speak, with a dog by her side, facing the man who had stolen her voice and trying to reclaim it in the most intimidating environment imaginable. The stakes had never been higher, the pressure had never been more intense, and in exactly 28 days, Emma Martinez would have to walk into Judge's courtroom and testify about the worst day of her life. The morning of Emma's testimony arrived with a weight that seemed to press down on everyone connected to the case. The courtroom was packed to capacity. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes broadcasting live coverage to stations across Ohio. This wasn't just another trial. It had become a referendum on innovative victim advocacy, on constitutional protections, on whether a child's trauma could be bridged by an animal's presence and unconditional acceptance. Emma woke at 5 a.m., unable to sleep any longer despite the early hour. Sophia found her sitting on the kitchen floor in her pajamas, staring at nothing. They had prepared for this moment for months, but preparation could never truly capture the reality of what was about to happen. Emma would have to walk into a courtroom filled with strangers. She would have to sit in an elevated box, alone and visible to everyone. She would have to face Richardson, the man whose actions had shattered her childhood. And she would have to speak about things that still haunted her nightmares. "We'll be there," Sophia said softly, sitting beside her daughter. "We'll be right beside you the entire time, I promise." Emma nodded, her small hands trembling. She was wearing a pale blue dress that Sophia had chosen carefully, nothing too formal that might intimidate her further, but something nice that would allow the jury to see her as a child, not a victim. Her copper-colored braids were freshly braided. She looked like any 8-year-old girl on her way to church, except for the hollow fear in her eyes that belied the normalcy of her appearance. Officer arrived at the courthouse at 7 a.m. The dog had been groomed meticulously, his coat gleaming, had briefed extensively about what was about to happen, the sounds, the people, the emotional intensity of a courtroom in session. Was as ready as a dog could be for something as unprecedented as what he was about to experience. By 9:30 a.m., the courtroom was completely full. Judge entered with her characteristic authority. The jury, having been seated the previous day, sat in their box with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort at the unprecedented scene about to unfold. Media representatives occupied the gallery seats, notebooks ready. Courthouse staff lined the walls, their official duties providing cover for what was essentially rubbernecking at a historic moment. Richard sat at the defense table with Richardson, his face an expression of controlled skepticism. He had filed multiple objections to his presence, arguing for reconsideration, but Judge had held firm. Richardson sat rigidly in his chair, his expensive suit crisp and pristine, his hair neatly combed. He had hired an image consultant to help him appear sympathetic and non-threatening to the jury. But his eyes were cold and calculating, occasionally flicking toward the courtroom doors where Emma would soon enter. Jennifer stood at the prosecution table, her expression focused and determined. She had prepared Emma extensively for cross-examination, understanding that the defense would be ruthless in attempting to discredit her testimony, would try to make Emma appear unreliable, confused, susceptible to suggestion. He would attack her memory, her perception, her emotional stability. It would be brutal and unfair, but it was his constitutional right. The bailiff announced Emma's entrance. "The people call Emma Martinez." The courtroom doors opened and Emma walked in holding officer's hand, walked beside them, his massive form dwarfing the child. The effect was immediate and visceral. Several jurors leaned forward, their expressions shifting from clinical observation to emotional investment. Sophia, sitting in the gallery, gripped a tissue so tightly it nearly tore. Emma climbed into the witness box with officer's assistance. The chair seemed impossibly large, her feet dangling several inches above the footrest, was positioned on the floor between Emma and Richardson, exactly as Judge had ordered. The dog lay down with practiced obedience, his massive head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained alert and focused on Emma. Judge addressed the jury before questioning began. "Members of the jury, you will notice that there is a dog present during this witness's testimony. The dog is here solely for the witness's emotional support and has no evidentiary significance. You are instructed not to consider the presence of the dog in any way when evaluating the credibility or reliability of this witness's testimony. The dog is trained to remain calm and will not affect these proceedings. The jury listened carefully, their initial curiosity temporarily satisfied by the judge's explanation. Jennifer approached the witness box with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with what everyone knew would be coming. She established basic foundational information: Emma's age, her school, her address, building comfort through simple questions. Emma answered in whispers, her voice so quiet that the court reporter had to ask her to speak up. Her eyes remained fixed on who never moved, never wavered in his presence. Then Jennifer asked the crucial question, "Emma, do you remember Tuesday, March 14th of this year?" Emma's entire body stiffened. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness box. Her eyes widened. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that they were on the precipice of something significant. Emma opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her jaw trembled. She was drowning, trapped in the moment that had haunted her for 8 months. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face. Roberto gripped the gallery rail so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then moved. It was a trained response, executed with perfect precision. The dog lifted his head and pressed it firmly against Emma's leg, not aggressively, but with gentle insistence. The dog's massive presence, which might have terrified in other circumstances, became an anchor. Emma's free hand dropped from the witness box rail and found his neck. Her fingers buried themselves in the dog's thick fur. The entire courtroom seemed to pause, suspended in a moment that transcended legal procedure and entered something more primal and human. In that instant, everyone present, the judge, the jury, the defense attorney, the journalists, the gallery observers, witnessed something extraordinary. They watched as a traumatized child, through the mediation of a dog's unconditional presence, began to find her voice. Emma closed her eyes. She took 3 deep breaths, her chest rising and falling visibly. Remained perfectly still, his head pressed against her leg, a living embodiment of stability. When Emma opened her eyes, something had shifted. The fear was still there. It would always be there. But it had transformed into something manageable, something that could be spoken into existence. "Yes," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, "I remember." "Can you tell us what happened that day?" Jennifer asked gently. And Emma began to speak. Her voice was small, trembling, barely above a whisper, but it was undeniably present. She described riding her bike, the store clerk, the afternoon sun, the false promise about the lost cat, the basement door that locked behind her. As she spoke, never moved. His presence became a psychological grounding wire, allowing Emma's traumatized nervous system to process the memory without completely fragmenting under its weight. She described her fear, her pain, her confusion. She described the violation and the helplessness. She described the terror and the shame. Richard's face darkened as he listened to the child's coherent, detailed account. His strategic positioning of between Emma and his client had backfired. Instead of seeming like a prosecutorial trick, appeared to be the only thing standing between Emma and psychological collapse. The jury wept openly. One juror removed her glasses entirely. The judge's expression remained professionally neutral, but her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her microphone. Emma spoke for 2 hours straight, her voice growing slightly stronger with each detail, his presence never wavering. When Jennifer finished her direct examination, the entire courtroom understood that something significant had just occurred. A child who hadn't spoken a complete sentence in 8 months had just delivered testimony that could convict a predator. And it was all because a dog had shown her what courage, when supported by unconditional presence, could actually look like. The cross-examination was scheduled to begin the next morning. Emma had left the courthouse yesterday emotionally and physically exhausted, having spoken more words in 2 hours than she had spoken in 8 months combined. Dr. Michael had examined her that evening, checking for signs of psychological trauma from the testimony. He found her deeply fatigued, but also strangely peaceful, as if she had finally released something she'd been holding inside for so long that she couldn't remember what it felt like to not carry it. She did something remarkable yesterday, Doctor told Sophia and Roberto in their home. She reclaimed her narrative. She took an experience that had silenced her and transformed it into words that could be heard by others. That's profound psychological work for a child. But the ordeal wasn't over. Richard would attack Emma's testimony with surgical precision. He would question her memory, her perception, her emotional state. He would attempt to plant seeds of doubt in the jury's minds about her reliability as a witness. This was his constitutional right, his professional obligation, his opportunity to sow reasonable doubt. Emma arrived at the courthouse at 8:45 a.m., her small frame wrapped in the same pale blue dress she had worn the previous day. Sophia had considered changing her clothes. The dress might trigger memories, but Emma had insisted on wearing it again. "Knows this dress," she had said simply. There was a logic to her reasoning that suggested her 8-year-old mind was still processing what had happened in that witness box. Officer was already in the courthouse allowing the dog time to acclimate before the proceedings began. Had performed flawlessly the previous day, his presence catalyzing Emma's testimony. But today would be different. Today would have to maintain his composure while a skilled attorney attempted to dismantle the credibility of the child he was supporting. The courtroom filled again with its cast of characters, media representatives, courthouse observers, the jury with fresh expressions after their overnight recess. Judge entered and took her bench. Richard stood to begin his cross-examination, and the tension in the courtroom became almost physically palpable. "Good morning," Emma said, his voice carefully modulated to sound friendly and unthreatening. "I know you've been through a lot, and I appreciate your coming here to testify. I just have some questions about what you told the prosecutor yesterday. Is that okay?" Emma nodded slightly, her hand already finding his neck. Remained perfectly still, his eyes forward, his presence steady. "Emma, when you were asked about March 14th, you said you remembered that day very clearly, correct?" began. "Yes," Emma whispered. "But Emma, isn't it true that after your rescue you didn't speak about that day for 8 months? Pressed, walking slowly in front of the jury box, making sure they were watching his movements, his gestures. "You didn't tell your parents what happened, did you?" "No," Emma admitted. "So how can we be sure that what you're remembering now is accurate? Couldn't your memory have been influenced in the months since the incident? Couldn't details have changed or become confused?" Was building his argument methodically, plant each doubt like seeds in carefully prepared soil. Jennifer rose from her seat, preparing to object, but she held back. She needed to let Emma answer. Emma needed to testify in her own voice, not through her attorney's legal objections. Emma's breathing became shallow again, pressed firmly against her leg. Emma's eyes closed momentarily, and when she opened them, her voice was slightly stronger. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember every moment." "But you didn't remember enough to tell anyone for 8 months, countered. "You were silent. You wouldn't speak about it. How do we know you're not remembering things that didn't happen? How do we know you're not confusing memories? You're only 8 years old, Emma. Children sometimes get confused about details, don't they?" It was a subtle but vicious line of attack. Was attempting to characterize her silence not as a trauma response, but as evidence of unreliability, of confused memories, of a child's inherent inability to accurately perceive events. But then Emma did something that seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. She sat up in the witness box. Her hand remained on his neck, but her voice, when she spoke, carried a clarity that hadn't been present before. "I remember because I was scared," Emma said, her whisper cutting through the courtroom with surprising force. "I was scared to say the words, but I remember everything. I remember his face. I remember the room. I remember everything. His tail wagged once, a subtle gesture, but it seemed to acknowledge Emma's courage. Paused, his rhythm disrupted. He had expected a frightened, confused child who would be easily manipulated through cross-examination. Instead, he was encountering a survivor who, despite her trauma and her small stature, possessed a clarity of purpose and memory that was difficult to discredit. "Did you discuss your testimony with officer before testifying?" asked, changing tactics. "Did he tell you what to say?" "No," Emma replied. "He let sit with me, that's all." "So officer did prepare you for this testimony," pressed. "He did work with you multiple times, correct?" "He helped me feel safe," Emma said, her voice steady. "He didn't tell me what to say, he just helped me not be so scared." The jury was watching this exchange with visible sympathy for Emma and growing skepticism toward tactics. One juror shook her head slightly, her expression suggesting disapproval of the defense attorney's aggressive questioning of a child. Spent 4 hours attempting to discredit Emma's testimony. He questioned her about inconsistencies in minor details, the exact time of day, whether the basement had one window or two, the color of Richardson's shirt. But on the fundamental facts, what had happened to her, who had hurt her, the specific details of the violation, Emma remained unwavering. Throughout the cross-examination, never moved. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, the importance of his absolute stillness. When Emma's anxiety spiked, responded with the faintest pressure against her leg. When she seemed to be losing confidence, the dog's mere presence seemed to remind her that she wasn't alone. By the time finished his cross-examination, he had failed to shake Emma's testimony in any meaningful way. The jury had witnessed not a confused child, but a traumatized survivor speaking truth with remarkable clarity and consistency. They had also witnessed what appeared to be an attempt by the defense to bully and confuse an 8-year-old girl, which had only increased their sympathy for her. Judge allowed a brief recess. Emma was taken to a quiet room with her parents and officer. Sophia held her daughter, and Emma allowed herself to cry, not sobs exactly, but tears of exhaustion and relief. Rested his head on Emma's lap, and the dog's presence seemed to complete the circle of safety that had begun forming months earlier. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreperson stood with the verdict forms in hand. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. "On the charge of aggravated assault of a minor, how do you find the defendant?" the judge asked. "Guilty," the foreperson stated. "On the charge of kidnapping, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." "On the charge of child endangerment, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." All 3 counts. Guilty verdicts across the board. Richardson's face turned ashen. His expensive suit and carefully crafted image couldn't protect him from the jury's verdict. He had been found guilty of predatory violence against a child. Emma gripped his collar, tears streaming down her face. But these were not tears of anguish. These were tears of catharsis, of validation, of her voice being heard and believed by 12 people who mattered in that moment. She had spoken her truth, and her truth had been vindicated. Sophia wept openly in the gallery. Roberto stood and applauded, and within seconds, several other gallery members joined him. Judge didn't stop the demonstration. She understood that sometimes justice, when it arrives, deserves acknowledgement. Officer watched Emma clutch, and he felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that he and his dog had helped make this moment possible. They hadn't provided therapy. They hadn't prosecuted the case. But they had created the conditions in which a silenced child could find her voice and use it to bring a predator to justice. The sentencing hearing would come in 4 weeks. The judge would impose 15 years, a significant sentence, but one that reflected the severity of Richardson's crimes against a child. But in that moment, as Emma buried her face in fur and finally allowed herself to grieve and celebrate simultaneously, The verdict itself felt like the most important form of justice that could be achieved. A child had been heard, a predator had been convicted, and a dog had shown the world that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes not from the sophistication of legal arguments, but from the simple, unwavering presence of unconditional acceptance beside someone who is finally brave enough to speak. 2 years had passed since that verdicts were read in Judge's courtroom. 2 years of healing, transformation, and the gradual reclamation of a childhood that had been violently stolen. Emma Martinez stood in the lobby of the police department on a bright Saturday morning in October, her mother beside her, accompanied by Dr. Michael, her longtime therapist. She was no longer the hollow-eyed, traumatized 8-year-old who had climbed into a witness box with trembling hands and a voice that had been locked away for months. Now Emma was 10 years old, a 5th grader with genuine friends, a robust academic record, and a quiet confidence that came from having survived something that most people would never have to endure. She still had nightmares occasionally. She still experienced anxiety in certain situations, but she had reclaimed her life in ways that had seemed impossible during those dark early months. She laughed easily. She spoke freely. She had experienced joy again. Sophia looked at her daughter with barely contained pride. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. Emma had returned to school and been placed with a trauma-informed teacher who understood her needs. She had participated in a peer support group for child survivors. She had continued therapy with Dr., who had guided her through the complex work of processing trauma while still developing as a child. Officer emerged from the K-9 unit with on a leash. Was noticeably older now. The German Shepherd was 11 years old, well into what would be considered his senior years. His muzzle had grayed significantly, and his movements were slightly slower, the vigor of youth replaced by the measured pace of experience. But his eyes remained bright, and when he saw Emma, his tail wagged with the same gentle enthusiasm he displayed during their first meeting at her home 2 years earlier. Emma exclaimed, a genuine smile breaking across her face. She knelt down to hug the dog and reciprocated with affection that was entirely unconcerned with protocol or professional decorum. He pressed his graying muzzle against Emma's neck, and she buried her face in his fur, breathing in the familiar scent that had become synonymous with safety. "Does remember me?" Emma asked, looking up at Officer. "Dogs remember who shows them love," replied, his voice warm with genuine affection. "And you've shown a lot of love over the past 2 years." Emma had not forgotten about after the trial concluded. She had written letters to Officer thanking him, and she had drawn pictures of in her art class. She had talked about in therapy sessions, understanding that the dog represented a turning point in her recovery, the moment when she realized that she could be present with something that might intimidate her and still feel safe. Sophia had arranged today's visit specifically because of an important announcement. 2 weeks earlier, Ohio's legislature had passed what was officially being called Emma's Law, a groundbreaking piece of legislation that established statewide protocols for the use of courtroom support animals in trauma cases. The bill had been championed by Assistant DA Jennifer, who had before the Judiciary Committee about the precedent-setting nature of Emma's case and the research supporting such animals' effectiveness. Emma's Law standardized training requirements for courtroom support dogs, established protocols for their use in criminal and civil proceedings, and provided funding for police departments to develop specialized K-9 units trained in courtroom support. It represented a fundamental shift in how the Ohio justice system approached vulnerable witnesses. Since the bill's passage, 10 other states had begun developing similar legislation. "We wanted to celebrate with you," and Sophia explained to Officer. "What Emma did, what you and helped her do changed things. It's going to help a lot of other children." Felt emotion tightening his throat. He had known that Emma's case was significant, but to see it crystallized into actual legislation was overwhelming. Had been instrumental in opening doors not just for Emma, but for countless future victims who would benefit from the presence of a calm, trained animal during their testimony. The police department had organized a small gathering. Jennifer was present, along with Judge, who had taken the bold judicial step of allowing in her courtroom. Dr. Lisa Park, the trauma psychologist who had provided expert testimony during the motion hearing, was there with research data showing that presence had resulted in significantly more coherent and detailed testimony from Emma compared to what would have been expected from a traumatized child of her age. Emma was presented with a plaque recognizing her courage and her role in advancing victim advocacy. She accepted it with shy graciousness, her hand finding his neck as she stood before the assembled group, remained perfectly still, allowing Emma her moment while providing his steadfast presence. "I want to read something," Emma said quietly, her voice still naturally soft but filled with confidence. Sophia had helped her prepare remarks, but Emma had insisted on writing them herself. "2 years ago I couldn't talk," Emma began, reading from a carefully prepared statement. "I was scared, I was sad. I thought maybe I would never talk again, but showed me that I could be scared and still be brave, sat with me when I had to say hard things, didn't make the scary things go away, but made me feel less alone. And when I didn't feel so alone, I could use my words. My words helped put a bad person in jail, and now my law is helping other kids use their words too." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Judge removed her glasses. Jennifer held tissues to her eyes. Officer looked at his dog with profound appreciation for the animal's role in something far larger than any individual case or courtroom proceeding. Over the following months, Emma became involved in victim advocacy in ways that extended beyond her specific case. She attended school assemblies with Officer and talking to other children about trauma, recovery, and the importance of being believed. She participated in training sessions for police departments interested in developing courtroom support dog programs. She gave interviews to news media, always with beside her, always using her platform to speak about other survivors who might still be seeking their voices. The impact was measurable and profound. Within 18 months of Emma's law's passage, 7 Ohio police departments had established courtroom support dog programs. 3 had already used their dogs in trials, resulting in 3 guilty verdicts in cases that had previously seemed difficult to prosecute. Other states, inspired by Ohio's innovation, began developing their own programs. What had started as one prosecutor's desperate effort to help one traumatized child had transformed into a nationwide movement, reshaping how the justice system protected vulnerable witnesses. Emma's case became required reading in law schools and graduate programs in psychology. Legal scholars cited it in articles about constitutional protections and victim advocacy. Trauma researchers included it in studies about animal-assisted intervention. Emma Martinez, who had been a silent victim, had become an influential voice in judicial reform. By the time Emma was in high school, she had decided on her career path. She would study criminal justice, following in Jennifer's footsteps, but with a specific focus on victim advocacy and trauma-informed prosecution. She had not forgotten what it felt like to be silenced, and she was determined to spend her professional life creating systems and spaces where other silenced victims could find their voices. Officer retired from active police duty when was 12 years old, transitioning into a consulting role helping other police departments implement courtroom support dog programs. Retired from active duty as well, spending his remaining years as a cherished companion in his home. But the legacy they had created together, one small girl's whisper transformed into systemic change, would outlive them both. Years later, when Emma graduated from college with her degree in criminal justice, she received a letter from Officer. Inside was a photograph of herself at age 8, standing beside in the empty courtroom during one of their preparation sessions. His head was pressed against her leg, and despite her youth and obvious trauma, Emma's face showed something transcendent, the first glimmer of hope that her voice, when finally spoken, would matter. "You and changed the world," the letter read. not just for you, but for children whose names we'll never know, who will benefit from protocols and laws that exist because you were brave enough to speak. Thank you for trusting. Thank you for trusting yourself. And thank you for showing us all what real courage looks like. Emma framed that letter and photograph. She kept them in her office as a law student, and later, as a prosecutor dedicated to victim advocacy. Every time she felt overwhelmed by the difficulty of her work, she looked at that image, a traumatized child and a steadfast dog, a moment frozen in time that represented the precise instant when silence transformed into voice, and voice transformed into justice. The ripple effects of Emma's courage continued expanding through the years, touching countless lives in ways both visible and invisible. Had not just been a comfort animal, he had been a catalyst for systemic change. And Emma, who had spent 8 months unable to speak, had ultimately used her voice to reshape an entire legal landscape, ensuring that other traumatized children would have access to support they deserved, spoken by voices that finally mattered. That was the true victory, not just one predator's conviction, but the transformation of systems designed to silence victims into systems designed to amplify their voices. One small girl's whisper had echoed through courtrooms, legislatures, and the consciousness of a nation, proving that sometimes the most powerful force for change is simply the courage to speak truth while someone steadfast stands beside you, refusing to let you face darkness alone.